begin by thanking Scott and the other organizers for inviting me and for hosting and putting on this super event. So I'm excited about all of my colleagues and you, all of us from all over the world coming together for this really important topic. I think particularly in these times right now, this is a very important place that we're talking together to understand in many ways a context for current life. So, and I think strategies for how to literally move forward. So I will, excuse me, it's early in the morning, I'm just starting to talk, so I might have to clear my throat a few times. I wanted to begin by just having us take a moment and do a little bit of conscious breathing. So just take a minute, get comfortable in your chair or couch or wherever you are, and just take a few breaths and notice the breaths that you're taking. It's not so much about altering your breathing, but just being aware of your breath, being aware of the details of your inhale, how your inhale transitions to an exhale, and just the small sensory details of your exhale. You might notice also that there can be a small pause at the end of the exhale before you're literally inspired to take the next inhale. So as we go through this short workshop, I'm hoping that we'll be living the principles that we're talking about. So I really encourage you to keep noticing your breathing as we do this next hour and a half, to really keep noticing your different sensations in your body, not again trying to figure them out or analyze them or judge them, but really to just hold them, take care of them, notice them, and include them in your experience of listening and thinking and looking and all of that. This is a very fundamental level, the basis of bodyfulness. So I'll begin, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about bodyfulness as a construct, as a kind of theoretical concept, and also as a practice, as a lifelong practice, that's both embedded in moment to moment in your daily life, but also is a kind of freestanding practice that you would practice sort of in a dedicated time. So this idea is both, again, embedded in a moment-to-moment basis and freestanding. So I got a lot of questions when I was writing the book. Why use this term? Why another term? Why, do another term? And so I think that's a valid question because there's a lot of terms in our world these days. So it originally came back from a feeling of irritation, actually, which for some reason is why I do a lot of projects, starts with irritation with something. But I was actually very concerned with the word mindfulness for a few reasons. So the concept of mindfulness, which is of course hugely popular right now all over the world, it definitely tended to include body states in it, like they would talk about mindful breathing and mindful moving and things like that. It's still, I feel like the word mindfulness still sees this phenomenon as a mental state, and this is actually fundamentally not accurate. this state of awakeness that we're trying to describe with mindfulness is not a particularly mental state. And so I was concerned about that. And I was concerned also that particularly in 21st century life, that we were still really privileging mental processes above physical ones, so that we were perpetuating a kind of mind-body dualism by using just the word mindfulness and including a few body things in the idea of mindfulness. And so I called it mental privileging. You know, you had mental privilege. And it also, many cultures really still are increasingly bodiless, what I would call bodiless. In other words, we're spending an average of something like 6.5 hours a day in front of screens and not moving around as much, enjoying the privilege of sort of distancing ourselves from physical labor, and looking at the politics of that is a very complex issue. Because it brings in issues of race and class, socioeconomic status, etc. So I was really concerned about that. But really, overall, we're really seeing what Thomas Hanna back in the 1980s called somatic amnesia. In other words, we're not paying attention to our bodies. And I think I saw the study where they said that in general, I think it was in the US, but in general, people only pay attention to their bodies under 3 circumstances. It was sex, exercise, and pain. And while those 3 are a good idea to pay attention to your body, living an embodied life, living a bodyful life is so much more than that. And we have to pay attention and be in the lived experience of our embodied selves really pretty constantly. So the other reason that I wanted to popularize this word bodyfulness is that my concern is that increasingly we see this kind of mental privileging as a method and a method of oppression. In other words, we use mental privileging as a way to oppress certain people, certain categories and identities of peoples, but also to just in general reduce people's sense of the rights of the body and the what I call bodily authority, that the idea that I am actually in charge of my body and I have rights in any society that are embodied rights is part of my increasing concern about this mental privileging. And so for me, the term bodyfulness is a political act as well as a psychological one and a contemplative one. So for me, the term bodyfulness really encompasses all of those elements. And our practices that we engage in for bodyfulness are going to look at how they apply, not just in interior situations in my interior life, but also my relational life and my social life, my political life. Okay, how you doing? So I'm going to play with my notes here. So as you can imagine, I really have this feeling that words matter. Words really matter. And they structure our thinking, they structure our beliefs and attitudes. This is why I wanted to coin this word. I actually didn't coin the word, but as soon as I wrote the book, it was interesting that several people from all over the world emailed me and said, oh, I've used that word before. So I think it's a good word, and we should all be using it in our own way. So again, the concept of mindfulness just doesn't catch it because it sees the mind as kind of this pinnacle, you know, this achievement, like, ta-da, you know, I have achieved mindfulness. But it has a again, that feeling of transcending the body rather than actually using and being a body. So it's very important, and this word shakes things up, I believe. I mean, my belief, of course, which is not everyone's belief, is that we are a body. It's not that we have a body, but that we are a body, and that the mind is just one thing that the body does, one of the body's operations. One of the ways that the body operates is to generate a mind. And so I am fond of saying we are and only are a body. And the body generates lots of different things, metabolism and movement and breath and all these wonderful alivenesses, one of which is a mind. Okay, so how's your body doing? Just take a moment and notice any kind of different sensations in your body. You might also want to wiggle around a little bit. Just make sure you're not feeling too sedentary. So, and just notice how your attention, and this is a core concept of bodyfulness, which I'll talk about in a minute, but that your attention can oscillate. In other words, your attention goes out to me, you're looking at the screen, you're listening to my words, but your attention can also go inside and momentarily check in. How's my breathing? How's my position? Is it supporting me? Is it supporting my breathing? Is it supporting a feeling of well-being in my body? How am I doing with moving? Am I just kind of allowing myself to be mobile and not, get fixed in a certain position and then lose track of my experience? Okay, so let's move forward with that idea that we're going to keep checking in, that it's not necessary to always have your attention landing outside of you. Attention outside of you is a great thing. It's an important thing. But we want to always have our attention flowing, oscillating. And one of the most powerful and profound oscillations we can have is back into our physical selves, our physical presence. Okay, because there's a lot of knowledge there. There's a lot of authority. There's a lot of ability to solve problems, particularly, and create well-being when we really listen to our embodied experience. And I'll talk more detail about that in a few minutes. So I just wanted to say a few words about the difference between the word embodiment and the word bodyfulness. Embodiment was, when I started writing the book, the closest term we could get towards bodyfulness. I think embodiment is kind of a basic ground. And so I think of embodiment, and here I'm going to read from the book, is awareness of and engagement with the body's states and actions. So bodyfulness comes on top of that. It's just like, the psychologist Abraham Maslow talked about the hierarchy of needs. We have a basic need for embodiment, for that awareness and engagement with the body's states and actions. But we actually are capable of much more than that. And that's what I wanted to do when I created the term bodyfulness. And so this idea is that after we fulfill that need for embodiment, we can then work on the practice of bodyfulness up in that hierarchy of needs. So bodyfulness is really embodiment put into a contemplative context. The embodied self is held in a reflective context. Oh, something was beeping there. I don't know what that was. Somebody is unmuted, but okay. So bodyfulness is embodiment in a contemplative context. It's also reflective. In other words, I am actually not just participating with my states and actions, but I'm reflecting on them. And it's non-judgmental, it's non-analytical, and it's really also looking at an ethical and aesthetic orientation towards your physical presence and your physical actions in order to lessen suffering and increase potential. So again, we're going beyond embodiment. We're going to ethics and aesthetics and contemplative states. And so one of the things that I think is so important about bodyfulness, embodiment, but then into bodyfulness, is the idea that we can have wordless awareness. In other words, that we don't have to be thinking to be aware, that there is an aspect of ourselves that has a very powerful wordless awareness, and that we certainly want to be able to use words in our awareness and attention, but we also want to be able to just hold and be with our wordless states. There's a lot of different reasons for that I could get into as a lecturer, but we don't have the time. So it's, and this kind of our attentive participation, it's rather than thinking that you're going to master something in your body, you're actually going to participate with it. It's a feeling of a kind of cooperative co-creation. And what I mean by that is that, let's say I notice that my throat is tight. And instead of, making up, probably perfectly good explanation for the tight throat, instead of even going there, I just hold my tight throat in my attention. I care for it with my attention. And I allow the voice of that tight throat to be there and to be present on its own terms, which are nonverbal terms. The throat is speaking, but it's not using words. The tension is a kind of voice. And we want to allow that voice to speak because it's a form of our intelligence that's very, very powerful and largely underused. So it's not that we want to stop using our cognitive intelligence and our verbal intelligence, but that there's a source of intelligence and authority that we're not tapping into as a bunch of cultures around the world. So this is why bodyfulness can be really important. And so I also have talked about bodilessness and disembodiment and misembodiment. So that can, I'll maybe if we have time and someone has a question about that, I can talk about that, but I actually right now want to move forward so we can do some practice. Okay, so again, just take a moment and oscillate your attention. Just take a minute to notice your breathing. Take a minute to notice also different sensations in your body. They could be pleasurable sensations, they could be painful sensations, or they could just be very neutral, the pressure of your butt on the chair. But just sort of say hello to different sensations that are happening without sort of telling a story about them or trying to change them. Just hello. Okay. Good. So keep doing that. Keep moving around. Keep and have fun with how you listen to and look at the presentation. So your body can really engage with it playfully. In other words, we can move, we can breathe consciously, we can work with conscious sensation and have fun wiggling with the presentation. Okay, So there's 8 core principles in Bodyfulness, and I'm just going to go through them really quickly, but just so that you can get a sense of how broad this construct can be, and how also each of the 8 principles can help you on your own authority design different practices that can help you cultivate this in yourself or in other people. So each of these 8 areas has a creative presence that you can play with experientially and in terms of your own practices. So actually, I think I need to back up for a minute, because what I want to say is that there's been a lot of different practices already out there for thousands of years that have a lot of features and elements of bodyfulness. One of the things I will say is that we could see it sort of along a continuum. In other words, there are these inherited, on this end of the continuum, we have these kind of inherited structured practices that are very disciplined and very precise. And so this might be yoga with its precision in the poses, or Tai Chi with its precision of the movement, where the movement goes, the shaping of the movement, the quality of the movement. It can be Aikido. It can be a lot of different practices. And even back in the 80s, people were talking about golf that way, and about basketball and things like that. So there are a lot of different, very structured practices, practices that are already developed, practices that are time tested in many, many different traditions. Okay, so that's on one end. Those can be bodyful practices. We have to put energy into them to make them bodyful, and I'll talk about that. But over here on this end is kind of creative, spontaneous movement, and movement that just emerges moment to moment, and so that is deeply unstructured and is very much occurring from listening to movement impulses and sensory data that are arising from within and arising from your sensory, your present moment sensory and motoric engagement with the world. And so it might be that I will pay attention to my hand, and I'll just notice that it starts to lift, and then it starts to rotate a few centimeters, and then for some reason the fingers start to extend, and I just, in a sense, rather than creating a specific movement, I allow a movement to simply emerge from my ongoing attention to my present moment experience. And so we want to see bodyfulness practices all along that continuum. My suggestion is that you have and develop practices all along that continuum. In other words, you have a nice go-to practice that, let's say, is yoga or Tai Chi, that you can do, and that is about these kind of precision and structured experiences of moving and breathing and sensing. But also make sure that you develop practices that are what I call emergent, right? That are emergent, that just arise from your ability to hold and care for your direct experience in the present moment. So a lot of times this end of the spectrum, this open end of the spectrum, is where a lot of therapeutic practices occur, because this allowing of emergent phenomenon to come up and have a voice is a lot about what body-centered psychotherapy is about. And Scott can maybe tell you a little bit more about that in terms of different programs that are out there about that, particularly in embodied philosophy. So there's this importance on both ends of the spectrum, okay? Okay, so now I'm going to go into the 8 principles. But remember, in all of the 8 principles, we have it that there are practices on one end and practices on the other end, and that we want to cultivate a nice plump, wide continuum of different practices, okay? All right, so the first core principle is oscillation. So I mentioned it before, and it's probably in a lot of ways one of my most important ones. Sorry, just checking the time. So oscillation it's a term that's used a lot in physics and engineering, and it's anything that is periodically goes back and forth. And so it's actually a really basic motion of both matter and energy oscillate. So when we look at the term oscillation, we're looking at something that's really fundamental. It's even occurring before life occurred. It's occurring in the physics of the universe, in subatomic levels as well as material levels. So it's the basic notion that there's this back and forth quality. But when we see life emerging, we see that oscillations take on a kind of special meaning when we see life emerging. So all life has oscillatory phenomenon. It's very easy to observe. My heart is beating, it's contracting and expanding. My lungs are contracting and letting go and expanding. My guts in peristalsis squeeze and let go, expanding and contracting. I have waves that occur, oscillatory waves in my brain that are a signal of brain activity. There's oscillations all through the body, both on large levels, observable levels, but also tiny, even subatomic levels and cellular levels. We see it in the level of the cell. There's a lot of ways that cells and the materials inside cells actually also oscillate. So oscillation is a very powerful physics principle, but also a biological imperative of life. And so one of the ideas of bodyfulness is that we can cooperate with these oscillations. We can actually cultivate a conscious relationship to our body's oscillations. Now, of course, that idea isn't new, but the idea that we're looking at a practice, a conscious practice that is really imbuing itself into our very biological natures, this idea of the different oscillations of the body can be a very powerful practice. And I really encourage you to play with, first by noticing different oscillations in your body, and then just cooperating with them. Again, not trying to control them particularly, but really listening to them, appreciating them, and finding, in a sense, the voice of this beautiful back and forth that life seems to manifest as. Okay, it also, for me, has a kind of psychological and philosophical idea that when we see that if you have an oscillation, you're oscillating along a continuum, and that continuum is where your life occupies, that continuum. And so your ability to fully occupy that whole oscillatory continuum, from the details of your in-breath to the details of your exhale, from that feeling that you can almost feel your gut kind of helping you digest by squeezing and letting go. So these ideas of also, I'm a neuroscience teacher, and so I tend to use neuroscience metaphors a lot. There's a lot in the body, in the literal physical body, that is really about the middle path, what Buddhism calls the middle path. In other words, we like to hang out most of the time in a kind of a middle ground. And we use the ends of the continuum for rare circumstances, important but rare circumstances. So our body temperature likes to be in Fahrenheit 98.6. And if it deviates from that, it's usually doing something important when it deviates from that. And so our blood pressure, our salinity, our oxygenation, all of these things, very basic life functions, like to hang out in a middle path, in a middle area, a middle ground. But they also like to swing adaptively, right? And so our bodies need to be able to adapt to changing circumstances, and also in some cases extreme circumstances, which is why we want to be able to occupy the ends of that oscillatory continuum. We want to be able to breathe really rapidly and breathe really slowly, this kind of thing. So again, there's a lot of powerful metaphors in this idea of oscillation. And the other idea is, if we think in oscillatory continuums, if we actually really take on this idea, I'd like to suggest that it also helps us resolve binaries. In other words, I am this or I am that. You are this or you are that. And that binaries are when we kind of ping pong between the extremes of continuums, good and bad, right and wrong, us and them. And so this quality of being able to say, okay, there might be some important moments, rare important moments where I can say us and them. But there are also these very important moments where I can see community, I can see interdependence, I can see interbeing. There might be a few extreme moments where I see everything as one. So I know we have a tendency to have a romantic notion about some of these ideas, but I think the body will teach us where we tend to fall, where we create distinctions, but we can oscillate toward fewer distinctions, no distinctions, and we can really strongly establish distinctions in other cases. So oscillation is a really big deal. Okay, so take a breath and notice that very powerful oscillation there. So the second concept is balance. And so our bodies, I've actually already talked about this a little bit. Our bodies really always want to find a sense of balance. When we're standing, we are always actively balancing. Actually, if we can't go back and forth in little minute micro movements, we can't balance and we tend to fall over. And so we also have a lot of set points, which our doctors are very fond of monitoring. So they monitor our temperature, our blood pressure, our oxygenation levels, our pulse, all these different set points where the body likes to find balance and then just do small, minute adjustments. So there's also a balancing act that life gives us, as well as these broad oscillations. And we want to be able to really cultivate and work with and find practices that help us feel those set points, feel those balances, a kind of home base. And in fact, I'd like to suggest that both oscillations and balance points are our fundamental sense of identity. In other words, they're really who we know ourselves to be. I am that person. For instance, for some reason, my whole life, I've had very low blood pressure and really high heart rate. I really am still investigating what that's about. But that's a fundamental feeling of when I wake up in the morning, my sense of who I am starts and really grounds in that experience, my physical nature, that's really fundamentally a part of my identity. So practices that play with our cultivation of the not only achieving states of balance, but also just physically playing with different, going into balance and off balance, into balance and off balance. Because it's only by going off balance that we can really feel when balance is achieved. So very much like leaning forward until you fall, there's this quality of feeling that and then finding your center by falling off of it. And that's a metaphor as well as literal. So the third principle is feedback loops. And so if any kind of, the body is really a series of feedback loops. The whole body is constructed this way. In other words, everything in our body is interdependent with everything else. We both have, we have liver cells, we have brain cells, we have bone cells. They have distinctions, but they don't exist without being related to each other and without also talking to each other. And so everything is networked. Everything is networked. We talk a lot about that in the brain in terms of neural networks and neural integration. But it's actually true all through the body, not just in the brain. And so we have a feedback loops. In other words, the liver talks to the stomach talks to the liver. They change their behavior according to their conversations with each other. The gut talks to the brain talks to the gut. Behavior changes as a result of their conversation. And so our whole body is a series of different feedback loops. The most strong one that we tend to talk about in my field, in body-centered psychotherapy, is the sensory motor loop. And so sensation coming in, either from the inside of the body or the outside of the body, going to the central nervous system, it's processed there, and every sensation rolls over into a responsive action. In other words, our sensory processes are always designed to generate a movement. That's why it's called the sensory motor loop or the sensory motor processes. And so everything is in a feedback loop. And in a sense, we could define health as that networked conversations between the different parts of our body as being in place and active. In other words, everybody's talking to everybody else. Everyone's working it out with everybody else. My liver and my stomach and my pancreas and everything else. Everybody's talking and working it out. They're a community that is healthy because they are connecting to each other. We could see illness as when that connection, that talking, that breaks down. In other words, the liver stops talking to the stomach, or the stomach stops talking to the liver, or the stomach stops being able to interpret what the signals are from the liver. And so you can see feedback loops as a way that we can actually define health or well-being as a communicative, networked, kind of community-based project that life is. And so part of what Bodyfulness is cultivating is this feeling of how I can help my liver talk to my stomach, or my stomach talk to my brain, or whatever. Now, we can't necessarily influence that consciously or directly, because a lot of what's going on in our bodies is what's called autonomic or automatic. We want that to happen. We don't If we had to pay attention to every little thing, like our hormone levels and our our moment-to-moment oxygenation, we wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. We have to be able to save consciousness, which is very expensive metabolically, by the way, for other things, creative things, adaptive things. So we want a lot of stuff to be happening automatically under our awareness. So it's not that that we can all of a sudden start directing our liver to talk exactly to our stomach, but that we are cultivating an environment that helps that to occur, that supports that to occur automatically. Okay, so the fourth principle is energy conservation, and that's, I actually alluded to it just now. Energy conservation is the fact that from the perspective of natural selection, the perspective of Darwinian evolution, we need to conserve energy. We need to find ways of expending just the right amount of energy to get something done and not overspending. Otherwise, we would have to spend a lot more time and energy on projects. And so life is always trying to conserve energy. The body always has limits, and a lot of what the nervous system is actually there for in our bodies is to select what's important to pay attention to and what's not important to pay attention to, because being awake is actually metabolically very expensive. For instance, our whole brain is only about 6 or 8% of our body weight, but it takes up about a quarter of our calories, our metabolism. It's a very expensive organ. And if you look at even within the brain, the parts of our brain that are working with conscious awareness are more expensive metabolically than the ones that are operating on automatic. So we're always trying to conserve energy. How we conserve energy is by forming habits. Habits are critically important. They're very, very important. You want to be able to learn how to ride a bike and then know that for the rest of your life, because it's a habit that's in your body. It's called a procedural memory, if you want to get neuroscientific about it. So you want to be able to get up and just brush your teeth and not have to teach yourself how to brush your teeth every morning. Habits are exquisite phenomenon, and they save energy. When you're learning how to do a sport or a practice, at first it's kind of awkward. It takes a lot of energy. You're tired afterwards because you've had to concentrate so much on what you're doing. And then it becomes kind of automatic, and there's just a blessing with that automaticity. And so a lot of what Bodyfulness looks at is this idea of energy conservation, and also the idea of habits. The more we have good habits, the more energy we have freed up for creative actions and creative thinking and doing and being. And so when we have that basis of literally good biological habits, it becomes very important. So the habit of posture, for instance, how we sit and how we hold ourselves can be either fatiguing or really help us conserve energy, so that a lot of our metabolism is available for our well-being and our creative energies. In that sense, a lot of therapy can be about this idea of changing these kind of biological habits in the body so that they become more efficient, they become more oriented towards our well-being, and then that frees up a lot of creative energy. And so, in a sense, body-centered psychotherapy and body-centered practices bodyfulness practices are about this idea of sort of retooling our energy conservation so it really works for us, and that we're spending energy in appropriate means. For some reason, my husband is opening the door, and so something must be really important. He has to get something, his phone. Okay, so fifth principle. How's your sensing? Just take a moment and pay attention to your left foot. Now pay attention to your right ear. And now just breathe with the idea that you can just support and say hello to your left foot and your right ear. Okay, fifth concept, fifth principle, discipline. And so discipline is a funny word, isn't it? We all have different associations to it. They could be really positive associations, like if you're a yoga teacher and you have a yoga practice and you're very disciplined about spending 45 minutes a day in different asanas that really support your well-being. So that's a great example of a positive connotation that you might have to discipline. Other people, let's say like myself, I was raised Catholic. I'm very, I'm getting up there. I went to Catholic school in the 50s, and I can remember getting whacked with rulers by the nuns. And so I have an old memory association to the word discipline that has connotations of punishment and control and things like that. So the word discipline can be really different for a lot of us and have different memories associated with it. So we want to kind of really work with this idea of discipline in a kind of an open way and not be driven, for instance, in my case, by my past, and not sort of reject discipline because I can only think of it as a method of ruler whacking or punishment or control or religion or whatever. Okay, so practice at something is vitally important. The body actually needs to practice things to get good at them. And this is a principle you can see every day. You had to practice riding a bike before you got good at it. You have to practice the guitar before you can play a song. We have to practice a lot of things on a daily basis, and there's a kind of a discipline involved in that. It is kind of about maximizing our operational efficiency again. And the body really does operate on a kind of use it or lose it principle. So we actually need practice, not only learning something, but continuing practice as a way to, again, maximize our well-being from these other perspectives that I've already talked about, these other principles. And so body efficiencies that come with discipline, that come with practice, really free up a lot of energy, and they create a kind of grace or ease. I've been writing a lot and speaking a lot lately about the concept of grace because I've been so interested that in English, and I would love to hear from others because we have so many people who speak other languages online here, that in English, the word grace means something given from God, a kind of blessing that's conferred from God, but it also means a kind of movement efficiency that comes from practice or discipline from within. So we say a dancer is graceful, or I always just powerfully, just was spellbound by Michael Jordan when he was playing for the Chicago Bulls. I mean, the grace in that man's body was just phenomenal. And so to see someone moving gracefully is someone who is really actually embodying some of these bodyfulness principles and has a sense of practice that creates grace, where there's grace is probably on a physical level related to this idea of the body's ease of moving, the body's finding the most efficient path for an action to happen, not too little energy and not too much. And really, that's what appears graceful. And so, but I'm very interested in that in English, grace has these two meanings. And I think there's a contemplative possibilities in looking at that. So let me know what you know about your own language and the word grace. So the sixth principle is that change is the norm and challenge is change. And so I'm a fan of and a student of Darwinian principles. And so a lot of this comes from Darwin originally. Probably there's other philosophers and such before him, but he really pegged it to a lot of the biological understanding of life. So particularly the ability to change is very fundamental. And in fact, one of the ideas of why humans have begun to occupy their place in the biological order where we are right now, for better or for worse, is because we're very adaptable. We can change when we need to. We can really fundamentally alter ourselves in a changing environment. And this is, in a sense, from a Darwinian perspective, a definition of fitness. Our definition of fitness is that we can adapt. We can change when we need to. And so we need both habits, things that we do all the time repetitively, but we also need to break habits when things change. And we need to construct and expose ourselves to novelty. And so novelty is actually just as important, and it stands almost like a yin and a yang to the idea of habit. We need novelty and we need habit. And so change, because change is so fundamental and so important. And so we want to really understand that novelty is a part of what we are interested in bodyfulness. So, for instance, a lot of the research that's coming out now about aging shows that one of the most powerful ways that you can push back against things like Alzheimer's and dementia as you age, or taking falls or whatever, is to learn new things. So it's not just to exercise. It's not just to exercise, but it's to create novelty. It's not just to do Sudoku or crossword puzzles. It's to create novelty, to expose yourself to new things. That's why they say, learn a new language, learn a musical instrument, learn something. When you're learning, you're working with novelty. And so part of what we want to do is to set ourselves up to be able to work with change, and to whether we really call that change to us consciously and we decide to change and we sort of consciously work towards something, or during the times when change happens to us and change is in a sense almost forced on us by, let's say, the death of a spouse or a global pandemic or a realization of social oppression. So change is sometimes self-initiated, but it's sometimes given to us through no conscious choice of our own. And so we want to realize the function of challenge in our life. It's important. In other words, some of this research on aging also talks about how we have to challenge ourselves physically. We have to walk briskly, let's say. We have to keep working on a yoga pose to really enter it more consciously and more in a more disciplined way. We have to challenge ourselves to learn new things and to make our body, in a sense, toned toward change as well as habit. Okay, and this takes us to our 7th principle, which is called novelty and learning by contrast. So there was a physician in the like 1930s or something named Edmund Jacobson, who was one of the first people who discovered the concept that we learn by contrast. In other words, the nervous system is designed to kind of run more automatically, to kind of go to sleep, to conserve energy when things are similar, when things are repetitive and not novel. So when things get really rote or completely known, we have a tendency to just kind of go, yeah, and look at something else, or kind of get sleepy or drowsy or go off somewhere. And so we actually have to create novelty in order to learn something. We have to get curious about something that is unknown or just on the edge of the known. And so we want to be able to generate novelty and generate contrasting experiences. Part of, for me, what has been, I've had to really work on in the COVID lockdown is that it has decreased novelty for me. It's decreased my ability to have conversations with friends that might be challenging, or to physically challenge myself by going into new environments, things like that. And so I've had to really get more creative about finding novelty in the midst of COVID. And I think a lot of the depression that we see and a lot of the mental stressors, mental and emotional stressors of COVID likely have to do with our really human need for novelty. And so how do we do that is a very powerful question. Okay, last principle. And then I'm going to race through other things. So maybe we have a few moments for some questions. So our last principle is called associations and emotions. And so a lot of our experience, our sensory experience, always starts being processed unconsciously, whether it's just a reflex action like a knee-jerk reflex. That sensory motor loop can be very automatic, processed more sort of simplistically. But then the higher we get up into the brain, the more processing occurs. But it's still, even at the level of our emotions and our initial categorizing of sensation, like, okay, this is a painful sensation, or this is a novel sensation, or no, I know this sensation, I've felt it a million times. All of that is occurring pre-consciously. It's occurring in parts of the brain. That kind of classification of incoming data is that categorization is actually occurring below conscious awareness, and always will be. Because again, it would be too expensive if we had to do it consciously. There's just too much sensation out there. There's too much input. And so the unconscious brain is always making decisions about what's important and what isn't to become aware of, right? To expend the energy to become aware of. And so what that does is it pulls in emotions and associations to help with that categorization process. So that question, how do we feel about it? If something is coming in, there's that sense of, how do I feel about this? Have I felt this before? Should I be afraid of this? Should I get excited about this, etc.? And so we have an emotional response forming before we're ever aware that a particular sensation is happening. And so it helps, this can help us understand how we can work with emotions, and how we can work with them is through what we call associations. So the brain is actually an associative organ. It's always, when sensation comes in, it's always saying, okay, have I felt this before? Was it in this category, or was it like this or unlike that? And so it's really trying to make a place for it in the world we have already constructed. And so we can work very consciously with that process by working with different associations that come up and emotions that come up. This is why psychotherapy works so profoundly, no matter what the system, with emotions and with associations. So for instance, Sigmund Freud pioneered the idea of free association. So I don't know how many of you know Freud's work, but what he did was he had patients lie down on couches and he said, just talk, just talk. And so they just started talking, and they would find different, what the talking did was it kind of relaxed their defenses, and they would start like interjecting words that would start to come up from more unconsciously processed phenomenon. And so a good Freudian will pick that out and start to say, you just said, let's look at that, right? So any psychotherapist knows how to do this, but a really good psychotherapist knows how to do this not only verbally, but non-verbally. In other words, the body is always talking as well. What I work with a lot, and what my colleagues work with a lot, is physical free association. The idea that I can listen to a sensation as a form of body speaking. And I can say, okay, that's a familiar one, that's a familiar one, and then, oh, there's that little tickle right behind my breastbone. Okay, I'm going to just shine the light of my attention on it. I'm just going to take care of it for a minute, let it talk in its own language. It doesn't have to go into Farsi or Spanish or whatever language is your root verbal language. Body phenomenon and body languages precede verbal languages, both in terms of your own personal development as a child, but also in the tree of life. So we want to come back home to our physical free association as a way to work with this well-being that is partly already constructed in this unconscious realm. And that's by working with associations and emotions. Okay, that is the 8 principles of bodyfulness. Again, what I would like to suggest is that you, from your own sense of your own bodily rights and own bodily authority, can find different practices that are already out there that help you cultivate each of those different 8 areas. And also that you can also find your own free play and free kinds of inquiry that allow you to cultivate unstructured and what I would call emergent practices that just are you following your direct lived experience. And so let me shuffle around my pieces of paper here. 3, 4. So take a moment, breathe, wiggle around a little bit, notice sensations, maybe get a drink. I'd like to suggest, actually I'm going to close the window because my neighbor is right outside.
Thanks, Christy.
Okay, yeah, they were right outside with a...
It's a great way of exploring communication information.
Right. Yeah. Okay. See, that's partly how you take away information that's not relevant so that you can concentrate on what's important. Okay. So there are 4 different means of how we can play with those 8 categories. So the means are we've already been using for the most part. So the first one is sensing. So it's vitally important that we pay attention to the ongoing information that's being exchanged between the different systems of our body and be more aware of sensation so that we can help it be usable for more automatic functions in our body, but also conscious actions that we might want to take or cultivate. And so being able to not only pay attention to what's painful or pleasurable, but being able to attend to what we might call neutral sensations and sensations that we don't usually pay attention to. So we both want to just go, oh yeah, there's that familiar tightness in my back. But we also want to say, I wonder what's going on in my right calf. And even though you don't get a real strong signal from your right calf, you can just put your attention there. Because the neurological principle is that what you pay attention to grows. What you pay attention to grows. What you shine attention is like sunlight and water to a plant. So when you attend to something, you grow it. And that's for, good or ill. So in other words, if you, like Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen master that I studied with for many years, he said, if you want to grow your anger, just keep paying attention to it. And so there, you can actually pay dysfunctional attention or too much attention or the wrong kind of attention to different aspects of your experience. And a lot of what I do in psychotherapy is to help people to functionalize what they're paying attention to. And a lot of what I get interested in as a clinician is how to help people pay attention to their direct experience and how to do that in a way that doesn't very quickly categorize it, judge it, dismiss it, or use it in a kind of manipulative way in terms of their own behavior. And to help sensory processing be creative, adaptive, and really working towards our well-being. And so we actually need to cultivate our ability to pay attention to sensation, but also to be able to take our attention away from certain things and put them on other things. This is a kind of sensory athleticism that can be very important. So for instance, I had a friend who just had a surgery, and one of the things that we played with on Zoom, of course, was how to, since the pain of the recovery was going to be there no matter what, she really wanted to work on being able to pay attention to something else as well as the pain. That she had felt she had listened to the pain, she understood the pain, and that she also wanted to be able to pay attention to something else. And so we were really working on that kind of athletic ability to take her sensory experience to something else. And in her case, she was looking out the window at a really lovely tree that was in bloom. And so she put her attention out there so she could do her own method of actually, it wasn't pain relief, it was pain restructuring. Okay, so sensing is really important. It has to do also with the position of the body and the movement of the body. We sense not only touch, taste, smell, etc., but we also have senses called proprioception and kinesthesia. Interoception is the ability to pay attention inside. exteroception, the ability to pay attention outside, proprioception, the ability to pay attention to our body's position in space and tone and balance. That's actually related to learning abilities and learning disabilities, is proprioception. So we have to roll around more. This is why playgrounds exist. We have to roll around, somersault, and get into a lot of different positions because kinesthesia and proprioception are so important. Create novelty that way. And that's one good way that yoga, I think, is very helpful because it puts you in a lot of different proprioceptive positions. So the next one is breathing. I recommend that you investigate a lot of different breath practices. Don't get wedded to one practice. Each practice has something that it focuses on and something that it doesn't focus on. I would really recommend that you have a kind of root practice that I would call conscious breathing. In other words, that's just an ability to track your breathing in detail without trying to change it, but just really noticing the small, subtle details of your inhale and your exhale. I have a long description of conscious breathing practice in my book, so you can go there. But there's some fundamental principles about balancing inhale to exhale, making breath efficient, not too effortful, not using not enough effort, etc. So a root practice that's just about the breathing that's embedded in your daily life. And then you can find other practices that might be for more extreme cultivations. And again, but that root practice of just really being able to hold your breath rhythms and really attend to them very carefully and very reflectively. There's a lot of metaphors in breathing, psychological metaphors and emotional metaphors that can be very powerful by simply observing your breath. A lot of different associations can come up when you breathe consciously. Again, breath practice is almost universal in different spiritual traditions for a good reason. Also because breathing is totally conscious as well as unconscious. It actually straddles both the conscious part of the nervous system and the unconscious part of the nervous system, which is a good thing. Okay, so the third way that we want to relate to bodyfulness is through moving, conscious moving. And so we have conscious sensing, conscious breathing, and conscious moving. And so the idea is that there's a lot of movement always going on in me interiorly, tiny little movements. You know, my pineal gland is squirting different hormones around, and my ovaries are doing something, and my testes are doing other things, and my lungs and my heart, everything's moving in there. A lot of it automatic, and a lot of it that I will never be able to track the details of, because that's the way my nervous system is structured, and I wouldn't want it any other different way because I need to free up my metabolism for creative things. So moving occurs, again, all the way from the subatomic level to the large expressive gestural and locomotor movement that we do all day. And so we want to be able to work with that whole continuum, to be able to observe tiny little micro movements and value them just as much as we do large observable movements and gestural and communicative movements, etc. And so we want to play with our movement very consciously. And I again would encourage you to find practices that are going to cultivate certain kinds of athletic tone in your body, whatever that is, but also practices about movement that are more open, that just allow you to play with open movement that doesn't need to go anywhere. So just dancing to some music or dancing to no music at all. just really lying on the floor, standing in the middle of your living room, and allowing your body to just be moved by your present moment experience. A little harder to cultivate, which is why we have a lot of structured practices that say, okay, now put your hand exactly here and bend it exactly like this. That's a great idea, but you don't want that to be your only practice, right? You want to be able to go, and I'm standing here right now, and it feels like there's a sort of a slight falling forward in my body. I'm just going to cooperate with that and let that happen. And then I notice that my head seems to turn a little to the right as I fall forward. So I hold my attention into my present moment experience so carefully and in such an open way, non-judgmental way, non-controlling way, that different movements just start to emerge, and different sort of narratives, what I call body stories or body narratives, start to emerge. And I go, oh, look, my body's starting to rotate now. I feel like I'm kind of looking up at the sun. Okay, and then it still is rotating, and then, oh, now my head is falling back. And so it has to do with what in dance therapy we call the difference between moving and being moved. You know how we just, we reach for the flower, we push the kid's tricycle, we do all these movings, conscious movings, purposeful things all day long. But then we'll, let's say, go to a movie, or in our case now, see a movie on Netflix or whatever, and we will say that we were moved by that movie, that we were moved emotionally, that actually the movie, what the movie was doing, moved us. Or a friend will say something to us about their experience, and we feel moved by that. We want to be able to cultivate movement practices that are both about moving, conscious moving, whether it's basketball or whatever. And we want to be able to cultivate practices that are about being moved, about allowing life to move us to different places. In other words, we're both the agent of our movement and we are influenceable. And so we want to be able to, again, hold that oscillation of being able to generate purposeful movement and be able to also be moved by life, being moved by life. And so, for instance, a lot of the social protest that's going on right now in Hong Kong, in the United States, in other countries, we are all very moved by that. It's important that we're moved by the experiences of others, the voices and the body stories of other people that haven't been heard, haven't been listened to, or are in danger of being repressed and suppressed. So this idea of being moved is so critical to our well-being, so critical to bodyfulness. And so we want to be able to have movement practices that encompass that. And so to have that oscillation be very large, from a very precise practice of the tiny little precision details of playing the violin, and that, if that finger, goes 1 centimeter too far, the note is wrong. That's a very precise, disciplined movement. But there's a discipline over here as well. The discipline of being moved is just as important as the discipline of moving. And so really look at your movement work in this way. That's my 2 cents about that. So the last principle is about relating. And so we relate. We not only relate to what's going on inside of us, but we relate to what's going on outside of us. We relate to others. This is a fundamental oscillation that we don't survive without. And so relating is a very, very powerful bodyfulness practice. We aren't just practicing when we're sitting on a cushion or in a yoga studio. We need to practice as we look our lover in the eye, when we look a police officer in their eye at a protest. We need to be able to relate to people. That bodyfulness is a practice that is embedded in relating as well as in just direct experiencing. And so what can be bodyful about our relationships is a very powerful question. I'm sorry I don't have an ability to go farther into it. And I notice we're actually pretty much out of time. So let's just take a breath and again, notice your body. But also notice a few details around the room. And you might want to look at a few of the little boxes that have other people in them. I can see Scott smiling. And just take a few conscious breaths. And now I'll just turn it over to Scott to see if we have time for a few questions. I know that you also said something about a quote, Scott, so why don't you take over here?
Yeah, thank you, Christine, for such an amazing class. I couldn't have imagined doing this conference without starting with Christine. I think her ability to articulate the subtleness of the human experience and be able to create such clear words and language and frameworks to help us understand it is beyond incredible. So thank you, Christine, for doing your magic as always. And I feel so blessed to just be able to hang out with you so much and learn from you. And so thank you for that. And without further ado, I will turn it back to you, Dr. Caldwell. Christine, if there's a quote or something you want to sort of leave us with.
Yeah. Well, I originally thought I should read something out of Bodyfulness, the book Bodyfulness, but I decided instead to go for the edges and go for current events. So, and I feel myself getting close to tears. I'm so moved by what's happening right now in the States. So I'll just sort of blubber through this quote. It's a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates, an African-American man here in the States, from a book called Between the World and Me. But all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions of all lands with great, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do, not just in our own personal practice, but in the body of the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine. We'll take some breaths together.
Yeah.
We'll feel the support of the chair, the earth holding us, in the magnitude of that resonance. Great. I want to thank you so much, Christine. We'll see you in about a half an hour to continue.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone who attended and is watching. This is such a powerful, important, and significant process that we are joining in together as a community. So thank you so much. And we will see you very, very soon.